This is such a neat opportunity for me. So I wish very much to be useful to you. You're welcome to use anything that I show you. If you have follow-up questions, email me. If you want articles, data, if I say something that you didn't understand, you can ask here, or if you think of it later, you can email, and I'm happy to share resources. I want to do that. So today, I'm going to talk about doing what works. And this is a concept that I stole from emergency medicine. There's a guy named Peter Rosen who says that there are 3 kinds of patients who come into emergency departments. There are patients who are doctor-proof. That means no matter what you do, they're going to die. There are patients that are, there are patients who are doctor indifferent. No matter what you do, they're going to die. Then there are patients who are doctor proof. No matter how much you mess it up, they're going to live. And then there are the ones in the middle. And these are the patients for whom you better get it right. You better get it absolutely right in a very fast way to save their lives. And I think we can borrow this in education, except for the teacher-proof. There are no teacher-proof kids, I don't believe. But there are definitely teacher-indifferent kids, a great proportion of kids, and sometimes they share certain characteristics that we could talk about. Like, for example, they probably do not receive free and reduced lunch, for example, right? They probably have parents who have higher levels of education, but these are teacher-indifferent kids, and that means the teacher can be really pretty messy with the instruction, and those kids are going to do okay. But then there are children for whom it really, really matters. And there are kids that, some kids are in, maybe even in very wealthy school environments. They may even have more vulnerability than being in a less wealthy school environment, because if they are in an environment where most of their peers are teacher indifferent, they're really, really, really vulnerable. So for us, we want to figure out how to access these children, how to identify them right away, and then bring the most intensive instruction that we can. And some of you probably know Eric Hanushek, and you probably follow his writing. I like his writing. I follow him all the way in his beautiful articles until he says this, and I'm not going to read this quote to you. But he says, if we just got rid of the lowest, he does it different ways, but let's say 15%, of measured efficacy teachers, right? We just take the lowest, the weakest efficacy teachers, just got rid of them. Can you imagine how destabilizing that is? It's a very neat and tidy economic analysis, and it's interesting to read, but you can't do this because it's a human business, it's a human system, and if you did that, teachers would close their doors, they would never disclose any vulnerability whatsoever, and you would lose your chance to shape teachers into the kinds of teachers who can reach the kids who really need that highly effective instruction. So then it makes me think about, well, what is the most effective instruction? What does that look like? How do we define it? And we know, actually the people who publish this, you can get this online. I have to use the strong laser, sorry. It's Cavalli and Fornes, 1999. Anybody ever read that? Meta-analysis. There are probably people in the room who have. Interestingly, Ken Cavalli, who's not alive anymore, he was not an RTI fan. He didn't like it. I edited his work the last year of his life on a couple of invited pieces, and he really did not like RTI, so it took a lot of work to figure out how to publish his work in an RTI book, let me tell you. But, but we did it. But the takeaway from his great seminal meta-analysis that you can get online and read yourself is that there's no effect for special instruction that is good and strong. And this is something we've sold. It's fool's gold to families, and they believe that there's this really powerful, highly specialized instruction that if only we had the right nuanced, and by the way, very, very expensive and costly batteries of assessment, which are interesting to reference because most people can't access that. It's not transparent, so it seems like, well, I just might not understand it. But it's so super powerful. If only we had that information, we could deliver truly, truly effective instruction. Well, there's your effect size on this side for highly special. These are, in this category, is anything that requires individual psychological, psychoeducational batteries of assessment to design the so-called intervention. That's the effect size that you get. Guess what's on this side? Everything that you could try tomorrow without doing any assessment, or maybe just a little bit of assessment, like, let's see what you can do on a sums to 6 measure. That would tell you as much as you need to know, and it would cost you 2 minutes. So there's really no effect for special instruction. So then we say, well, what is teaching? What is effective teaching? Some of you might know Kent Johnson. That's a picture of him right there. That's Kent in Seattle at He started Morningside Academy. Anybody ever heard of Morningside Academy? It's been around a long, long time. He is one of my professional heroes. And his quote is my favorite quote that I've ever heard. So I'm going to share it with you, which is, teaching is not telling. So what I'm doing with you today is not effective instruction. It's the worst way to do it. And he probably extrapolated that a little bit. He's a behavior analyst from Fred Keller's quote, which is, the learner is never wrong. So how do we define effective teaching? Effective teaching is teaching that produces learning, period. The learner is never wrong. If the learner didn't learn, then I didn't teach you, right? It's a different way to think about it, and that's what formative assessment is supposed to be about. So on the left-hand side of now this is a different source. This is a source everybody knows now, visible learning. But on the left-hand side, these are all of the things that make a difference. Our effective tactics. At least we know before we start. They have to be implemented well to work, but these are potentially very effective tactics. And then on the right-hand side, we have all of the things that the school board wants to talk about. Every year. On this side, we also have the things that go away and come back with a new name, but it's the same darn thing all over again, and we're still talking about it. We're still talking about it. So to the extent that we can say to teachers, look, what you do really, really, really makes a difference. So step number one is to choose the things that you know can be effective if you implement well. It won't be sufficient. It is a necessary first step. You'll have to do more. You have to manage implementation, which is what I'm really going to talk about. But I took Hattie's effect sizes from his book. Oops, other laser, right there. And then I just took some NCE scores and connected them with a trend line across years. This was the old SAT-10 measure, which is no more. And I fit Hattie's effect sizes onto those data, and I show this to teachers all the time. And I say, okay, choose what you do because it's going to make the difference that's very predictable if you implement well. And so I always say to teachers, it gets really easy. I don't have to tell you what works. You can look yourself, and you can say, okay, let me do formative assessment. Let me use comprehensive treatments for SLD. Let me focus on really highly effective corrective feedback delivered at high doses and in very specific ways. Let me avoid things like investing in teacher subject matter knowledge. That's one that keeps coming around. It's so popular. I work in math. School-wide math improvement is my specialty. And people always want to talk about this. You do not have to be a subject matter. By the way, IES just released another study last year, big investment, found it yet again. It may be necessary, but it is not sufficient. So if you take people and you randomly assign them to very intensive training in the content knowledge, you can build the content knowledge. It will not raise student achievement. So it's not enough. It's not where you want to put your money if you care about having an effect. So if we use student learning as our compass, then we can identify the right actions. We can be guided by that in our own environments if we're collecting the right information. And this is easier for you to do than it's ever been because everybody has so much data. Dave Tilley and I wrote a book years ago on pitfalls of RTI implementation. It's a little tiny blue book. My husband said it looks more like a special issue of a journal, not like a real book. But every chapter was a common pitfall that we have seen in practice. And one of the chapters is called paralysis by analysis. A lot of places are engaged in paralysis by analysis because they have so much data. And they're interpreting very little of it, and they're overwhelmed by it, and when it disagrees, they don't know what to do, and so guess what they say? Let's collect more. Right. And that's very expensive. It is not benign, and we end up teaching teachers to ignore the data. That's what we end up teaching teachers to do when we have so much of it. So if we can figure out how to consume our data and follow our data, then we can make the changes that will help us locally get the results that the research tells us is possible. Okay, so your first activity is a poll. I've never done this before. I may screw this up. You're guinea pigs. So supposedly you can click on that link, and I can click start on the poll. And we're only doing one of these, so if it's terrible, it'll be okay. The other activities should work because they're a little more old-fashioned. Okay, let's see. So I'm going to start. Okay. And so the first question is, because I did say start. Okay, how do you identify an evidence-based tactic? And you should be able to vote live on that link. Did it say that it started when you clicked? Okay, so you can select, and you can choose, I'm kind of forcing you to choose one. Journal articles, policy documents and guidelines, websites, your own evaluation data. Those are your choices. There's only 2 questions in this poll. Let's see. Yeah, I did do that. Check it out. You guys read journal articles. That's fabulous. Can you see the results coming in from where you're sitting? It's kind of small. So let's see, journal articles has 30 votes, 32. Policy documents has 15, websites is 8, your own evaluation data. Websites could be things like the RTI tool chart from NCII. It could be what doesn't work, clearinghouse. It doesn't necessarily have to be like a Google search, right? Right? I mean, I use websites. Okay. I don't know how many people are in the room, but it probably closed. So interesting, in this group, it's mostly journal articles. That's great. That's great. I mean, that is the gold standard place to go if you want to say and claim that something is an evidence-based tactic. You really have to understand it. This literally happened to me yesterday. I have a tool, and the implementation support person associated with my tool said, well, when I worked for NWEA, we always referenced this particular study, and it was the Measures of Academic Progress Effect on Student Achievement. Anybody seen that study? Because it actually was not published in a journal article. It was published by NCEE, so it's about 700 pages long. Well, she was a rep, but I'm a researcher, so I read this study. And actually, the study shows there's no effect. So I just said, well, that's great, but you're literally giving out a study to people to support a measure for which the data said it didn't work. But so it didn't make it into a journal article. If it had, probably it wouldn't have taken 700 pages, and maybe that conclusion would have been more apparent. So you have to consume the information, right? And it's just like in medicine, you don't want to get your evidence from pharmaceutical reps. There's a conflict. So if you can go to the source and read it directly, that's the best way to do it, I think. Okay, so let me see if I can run the second question, which is a follow-up. I can't believe this is working. Okay, so the second question is, to collect your own program evaluation data, you must have, this is kind of a softball, you guys are sophisticated, but data on the tactic is A, B is data on student learning improvements, and C is both A and B. It's a softball. Okay, everybody's getting it right. Yeah, I mean, you do, but it's interesting because a lot of places don't do that. A lot of places don't do that. So even though you should, I work in schools all the time where they are looking at maybe year-end test scores, but nobody actually has any actual use data on what it is that we say that we are actually doing. That's hard to get. And it's good that we know we need it. We probably can do better about figuring out how to collect it. I reread on the way here yesterday that great Fixon and Blaze article from 1993, I believe it was, in Java. Does anybody know that article? I can send you a link to it. It's in my top 3 favorite articles of all time. So I reread it on the way here, and there's a great quote in that article that I was going to put in here, but I had too many slides anyway. And basically, Dean Fixon and Karen Blaze say you have to have those data because you don't know when you go to scale what is an effectiveness issue and what is an implementation issue. And if you don't know the difference, you can't fix it and make it work in your environment. So one of the things that I think we could do better in education is think about yield. We don't pay attention to use of the tool. We don't pay attention to the cost of implementation. We don't pay attention to the cost of what we select. So a good first step is what's effective, but there are way more effective, way more expensive solutions and way less expensive solutions. And really, it's our responsibility to think about yield. What's the return on investment for the things that we choose? It's a zero-sum game. I work with systems all the time that are using 3 and 4 and 5, and actually we have a study that's coming out in School Psychology Review. It's accepted, where we looked at a district's practices related to reading screening, and they gave, in this one system where most children are learning to read, this district gave 10 reading screenings in a single year. To me, that's crazy. It's insanity. It's the definition of insanity, and I promise you it's happening in your schools. Overassessment is one of the most pernicious and ubiquitous threats to RTI effects that I have personally seen. And I've built measures, and I encourage people to measure, and I cite Hattie's data with formative assessment showing you the power of measurement. And yet, I think what happens is that's easy to train teachers to do. That's easy to train principals to do. They say, okay, that's a good thing. I get praised for doing assessment, so let me do more of that. More might be better. We found a negative correlation. We actually studied benefit using hierarchical linear modeling across 7 schools with about 800 students. In grade 3, we followed them through the end of grade 4. And in this research study, we found a tiny, tiny bit of benefit for frequent reading screening for only the very most at-risk students. We actually found harm for higher performing students. So we have to start paying attention to that. That's about yield. That's about yield. What is the effect for the cost? Well, you only have 2 choices. You can increase the effect or lower the cost if you want to increase yield. So in medicine, I love medical examples because they just seem to work, but we can always look at something like a statin drug. There are probably people in this room who are on a statin drug. Statin drugs are used to lower cholesterol, and everybody takes them, north of 40 and 50. But this is the effect from actual randomized controlled trial data. This is the percentage risk reduction that you get. And the source is right there at the bottom, the nnt.org, which is I love that site. So if you take a statin drug, this is your percent risk reduction. If you take a placebo, there's your effect. I tell you what, I got no problem with the placebo effect when you get a good one. There's nothing wrong with a placebo effect. I do not hate the placebo, but this one, it doesn't work. It shows that there is an effect for statin. But here's the question that wasn't asked. They chose the wrong counterfactual. The best counterfactual is what happens if you just control the diet. So that's a Mediterranean diet. Now, easier said than done, right? Because we don't follow diets. But it is definitely cheaper. It has fewer side effects. And those are the questions we don't ask. So let's talk about how to translate that idea to your academic world. I'm an academic researcher, so all of my examples will be academic, not I love PBIS work, but I don't do that anymore. So mine will all be academic. Here's a take-home. If you do nothing else, use more class-wide intervention. Use more class-wide intervention. You know, I said I love that little site, the nnt.org. That stands for Number Needed to Treat. Number needed to treat is a beautiful risk reduction metric that you can only calculate if you've run a randomized control trial. We did that for class-wide math intervention in a district in Mississippi, and with about 700 kids. And we found that the number needed to treat for class-wide math intervention was 7. Guess what number needed to treat for a statin drug is? 196 to 200. Lower is better. 1 is perfection. You never get 1. But what that metric means is, let's say it's 7, which it was for class-wide math intervention. If I give class-wide math intervention to 7 students, I save 1 from failing the high-stakes test. How amazing is that? Pharmaceutical companies are overjoyed to make you get a statin, and insurance companies are happy to pay for it with a number needed to treat of 200. So we can get really, really strong effects for class-wide intervention. So if you take nothing else away, if you want to improve yield, use more class-wide intervention. It's very powerful, especially if your data look like this. These data come from one of my tools, but this is math performance in a class at screening. A lot of places don't even unpack their data at the class level in such a way. And that's crazy. You cannot install tier 3 interventions into this context and have success. And guess what? You cannot do sort of a softball approach to improving core and get much of an effect there either. You have to be more structured, more targeted. Why? Because it's higher yield. You could spend all kinds of money on professional development all year and not change this scenario. You need coaching. You need a specific system for people to follow. You need actual tangible materials that are provided so they have them at their fingertips. You need assistance with the data interpretation from week to week. So teachers are really empowered to do those things that will raise achievement. So the second slide here is to encourage you to manage the interventions that you do. So we prescribe lots of interventions. Just like doctors prescribe lots of medication, I bet there's lots of you in this room who have been prescribed antibiotics and didn't finish the prescription. I am guilty of that. I never finish. I just don't take them anymore because I'm not going to finish it. So unless I'm really dying, I just don't take them. And so far, I just assume I'm really not going to die. But when we say that an intervention is needed, we need to be willing to follow that up to see, did it occur and what's the effect that it's having. So what you're looking at are classes at a single grade level in a single school that were all getting class-wide math intervention. So what we can look at is the number of level changes, that's progress, the number of skills mastered by class, and if everybody is getting the same class-wide intervention, then which classes, oh I should have done this as a poll, just Coral respond, which classes do we need to go to when I'm only on the ground for 1 day a week? What classes do I need to go and provide some coaching support? 9, 10, and 11. Right, because they are not mastering the skills at the same pace as and you know what happens if you've ever done any coaching? It's this teacher who invites you in. I mean, she meets you at the front door and says, I love the intervention, it's great, come watch me today. And you know what? You want to. It's fun to watch those teachers do it. These teachers, they don't even open their door. They know you're in the building and they're like, oh gosh, I hope she doesn't come to my room. And that's where you need to go. So in my world, I build tools. I have some software, and we actually have a coach dashboard that generates a list, live for the coach and the administrator that says these are the classes that need to be visited because they're not growing like we expect and given math intervention. Okay, so your goal is to make sure that everybody grows. So every line should go up. Now, this child may still get moved to a tier 3 intervention. They grew, but there's a gap. And the gap is not closing. It's not really closing. They're growing at about the same pace as other students in the class. So they may move to a tier 3 or a small group if you happen to have one that fits. But the goal is somebody should be looking at the data every single week to verify that children are growing. I said this, when managed, it really can work, and I gave you the number needed to treat of 7, but look at what happens if you just focus on kids who failed the year-end test from the year before. It's a higher risk group. So great news, if you have a really high risk group, then you've got a better chance to have a more dramatic risk reduction effect. It's a little bit of a silver lining, but you can get a very strong effect. Look at the number needed to treat for children who are on an IEP. If you give 3 children who are on an IEP, if they get class-wide math intervention in general education with their peers, you will save 1 out of 3 of failing the high-stakes test. So, if your state is a state that considers segregating those children or not exposing them to a class-wide intervention, that would not be a wise decision if you care about yield, because they can really, really grow. So we used to say before PBIS, what is the way, or PBS when I was training, but what's the way teachers most commonly try to change behavior? Longer, louder, meaner. Not anymore. But it used to be, like when I was in school, it was longer, louder, meaner. That's how we changed behavior. We're doing that. We are making that mistake in academic intervention. So if you want to improve yield, be smarter about how you select your interventions. There is a real instructional science to this. You should know it deeply. It should be your mission for your people to know it deeply because it really, really works. And this is a smarter way to define instructional interactions with child performance in ways that you can develop interventions that will work if correctly used. So if a child is at the acquisition stage of learning, for example, it's a new skill, their response is very likely to be inaccurate. We really don't care how fast they do the work. In fact, we want them to slow down. These are the intervention tactics that work. These are the evidence-based tactics that are aligned with this. So you can't just go to the literature and go, oh, okay, these are evidence-based tactics. I'm going to use them for a child who needs this type of strategy. It doesn't work that way. So what happens is if you're using these tactics for a child who needs fluency building, you actually suppress learning. It's if you like data, it's fun to watch because if a child is matched with the wrong intervention tactic, their trajectories flatten out. Isn't that cool? So this is a smarter way. This is better than longer, louder, meaner. And if you want to improve yield, stop defining intervention intensity as more minutes, fewer kids, more days per week. Stop it, stop it, stop it. It's a bad idea. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. It was a first guess effort. I know where it came from. I won't call out the articles because I don't think that person intended for it to be translated so concretely. It was done in a certain way for research purposes, but this is a smarter way. So how do we institutionalize that? Avoiding over-assessment, I said that. This is our, by the way, we had a negative correlation between the amount of screening and outcomes. And so this is an illustration for you. This is a graph that's in our article. We took the commonly used reading screenings. I'm not picking on any of them because I don't care. They all performed the same. So the takeaway message is you don't need all of them. Pick one. I don't care which one you pick, really, if you have a rationale for it. But let the other ones go because it's not helping your decision. So what you're looking at here is the percent of incorrect decisions. So the base rate of failure was 16%. So if you didn't assess at all, you'd miss 16% of kids. But you'd have invested 0 assessment time. If you use curriculum-based measurement, you will make about an 8% error rate, but you will have only spent about 3 minutes total. And if you use DRA, this is a per kid estimate of time, you're about the same accuracy and you will have spent about 30 minutes per kid. And if you use MAP, you will get a little improvement in your accuracy. By this is not that dramatic when you actually look at the numbers and base rates, but it is superior. Of course it would be. It's an hour a kid, just about. It's 45 minutes, and it's expensive. MAP is, I've heard in many places, $15 per kid per year. Holy cow, it's a lot of money. So, you know, this is one way to look at that. Let's pick the highest yield, lowest cost, most accurate screener. Pick one and then do it. So what are the most pernicious effect stealers or diminishers? I've listed them for you there. I'm not going to go over those. Okay, so our second activity, this one I want you to think about rate of improvement and costs and yield and what that could look like. So if you have a little piece of paper in front of you, which I think everybody does, what I'm asking you to do is think about your own system, and nobody's going to be called out. This is really an exercise for you. But think about what are the costs associated with the screening instruments that you're using. A lot of places don't even know what all's being used. Like when we did our study, we reported our findings to the district, and they were sort of like, wow, who knew, right? So what screening instruments are being used? What are the costs associated with each screening instrument? Because sometimes people don't know that either. And, you know, $15 a kid is different than $5 a kid. There's a real measurable cost to that. So screening assessments, and then intervention materials. What are the costs associated with intervention materials in your system? What about professional development? That shouldn't be plural. And then what is the return on investment? How would you know? Can you know in your own setting? You are the experts in your state. Can you know what the return on investment is for these investments that you're making? So I just want you to kind of just jot those notes, and I'm going to give you like 2 minutes, like real quick. Just, there's no right or wrong answer for this one. This is really just for you. Okay. All right, you're just getting warmed up, but I'm gonna cut you off. I just wanted to plant the seed, give you a chance to think about that for yourself. I have some more content I want to get through. I don't want to be married to my content to the exclusion of your learning, though. I'm here for you. But hopefully that gave you just a start of thinking about that, even having that conversation. We don't even talk about that in schools. We don't even talk. If we did, we would not have schools giving 10 and 12 reading screenings to children, for the most part, who are learning to read. By the way, I had that experience with my own kid. I sent my child off to school when he's now taller than me, but when he was a first grader, he hopped in the car and he goes, "Mom, the library's closed for 2 weeks." And I said, "What are you talking about? The library's closed for 2 weeks." My mother was a librarian, so he goes, "Well, we have to do all of those," I think he said assessments. "I think we have to do all of those assessments." And I said, "What are you talking about? You got to do all those assessments. What's happening?" He goes, "Well, we all go to the library. They did the STAR, they did Dibbles, they did all the subtests of Dibbles. This is a very high, 100% of children in this school by grade 3 are reading. Okay, all the Dibbles, STAR, a couple of other things, but long story short, close the library for 2 weeks. Well, you can do that math. There's about 16 weeks per semester. They're going to do that about 3 times per year. So, and I said, oh my gosh, we lost the forest for the trees when we are closing the library in the name of improving literacy. I mean, it's happening. Right, it's happening. Here's one you can also probably relate to, and it is kind of makes you laugh a little bit, but it's real serious. Like children who are getting Tier 3 intervention to the exclusion of any enrichment opportunity, any playground time. Guess what? That stuff matters. I mean, you get outside of our world, go to a cocktail party, and talk to the most successful people. They weren't like us. They weren't. They don't feel that way about it. I'm on a school board with mostly business people, and somebody said one time, I had never heard it before, but I don't run with that crowd, which was doctors make A's, lawyers make B's, and CEOs make C's. And like they all want to be CEOs. Like it's just, there's something to social skill development and opportunities to practice that, and by the way, I know personally when I was in elementary school, I didn't go so I could, learn to read. I was interested in what's the special puppet making activity today. Like I just got to get to the puppet. That's what I'm here for. I mean, that's called normal. That's what children want to do. Have you ever been asked to do something you're not good at and to persist at it? That's become the experience of our academically vulnerable children. And we've taken away everything that's fun or relaxing in the name of intensifying instruction. Absolutely, we have to intensify instruction. We need to be smarter about how we do it. The way you do that is you save time doing things that aren't going to benefit that child. Okay, so there's a guy named Atul Gawande. Does anybody follow him or like him? I love him. Yeah, the Checklist Manifesto, yes. He has a new book called Being Mortal. It's really good. I follow him on Facebook, so I read his posts every day. And anyway, he's a great speaker. He did a TED Talk, and I feel like it would be just a dynamite. If I ever got to run a school, people like me always have a fantasy about getting to run a school. Not for a whole year, for about a week. But if I did, I would totally do, I know which faculty development activity I would do. I would do his talk. It's only 10 minutes. It's a TED Talk. It's online. And he's talking about really the ideas that are in the Checklist Manifesto. And it's all implementation science, although he's not citing Dean Fixon. He should be. But he's talking about, in complex systems, how do we get the things that count to happen with quality? Which is what we're all about too. And the point that he makes is, and it's very relatable, he says, in medicine, we've become so uber specialized in medical care in the United States that literally, and I know this, my husband's a physician, so I can relate to this because he will call the orthopedic surgeon he's an ER doctor, nobody likes to hear from him in the middle of the night, but he will call the orthopedic surgeon who is on call, who will say something to the effect of, "Oh, I'm so sorry that his arm is broken, but I only work on the pinky finger. That's all I can do." And that truly is the way it has become in the United States. So he says we have all of these uber specialized, completely disconnected systems of care, none of which talk to each other. Well, I have news for you. That's absolutely happening in our world. So we have teachers in the lower grades who routinely say, I can't teach math. That's not what I do. You can't teach how to combine numbers? Yes, you can. It's not that hard. Let me teach you how to teach it. You should be able to teach it. If you can't teach it, that's kind of a problem that you're teaching this grade level. Well, and most teachers who teach at the lower grades don't often teach at those grades because they love to teach reading. But what happens is children are not getting the dose of what they need in math, and then we detect it at grade 5 and panic. We've missed this window to really prevent that. So he says we need to study our failures, identify the pause points, and find ways for these very complex systems to talk to each other. I served as an expert on a case over the summer, and it was eye-opening to me. Not in my state, in some other state. The attorney found me on the web. Read something I had written and said, I think I'll ask her to be an expert. And so it was really fun. I had never done that before. But I had a chance to read everything that happened to this child. I couldn't put it down. I literally sat at my table in my office and read for 12 hours. Everything that this child experienced for the child's schooling career. And it was eye-opening because this child got so much expensive and good things. I mean, I could find it. I could find the oral reading progress monitoring fluency data for the child when the child was being pulled out and participating in small group intervention. This is a child who was rarely at school. They found her, they detected her, they delivered intervention, they collected progress monitoring data, they had problem-solving team meetings about her, they eventually ended up doing an evaluation. There was a lot of parent pressure around that. They ended up doing an eligibility evaluation, which is part of why I was in the middle of this now. And in the evaluation, none of it talked to each other. The evaluation didn't include any of her RTI data at all. Said, in fact, that she had been absent 0 days or 2 days. She'd been absent 50% of the school year every year she'd been in school. None of it talked to each other. None of it talked to each other. And I thought, gosh, it's so remarkable that each piece got done. Imagine if it had talked to each other. Imagine if those pieces and parts had talked to each other. It would have been a better result for the child because the child got lost in that shuffle of what do we call it and what's our legal reaction to this rather than let's just teach a child how to read, which we can't do if we can't get the child to school. So let's get the child to school. And there were hundreds of pages of referral to Department of Family Services. And you know what that says to me? That doesn't make me feel like what a great protection for this child. That makes me feel like what an abysmal failure that was at protecting that child. Didn't work. But nobody talked to each other about any of that. So we need to find what are the active ingredients that make specialized care work, correct and early identification of risk in our setting. This is critical. We should be looking, we should be identifying who is at risk, classes of students who are at risk, correct selection of the intervention tactic using that triangle that I showed you, deploying intervention to whole classes and individual students, addressing system targets. I find most places don't even talk about system targets, but that can be so powerful. And then integrate with your core instruction with leadership decisions, resource allocation decisions. Okay. So if we pay attention to evidence, that's a good start. It won't be enough because we are not going to have stable treatment effects. We have to do those things to make sure that we get stable treatment effects. We have to implement thoughtfully and with more control, and it might look a little different in some contexts compared to others in order to get the results that we know we can get. So I love this quote from Dave Tilley: the challenge is not about knowing what to do, it's getting people to do it. And it's a fair question that I reflect on all the time. For all we know, and I mean, look at what's happened in 20 years in education. We know so much, more than we ever have. How come we've not been able to assure that every single child gets the most effective instruction possible? And we haven't. And one of the things that I've been thinking about, and it's funny because I thought it was my idea, and then I discovered that the National Implementation Research Network had been writing about it for years. Hate it when that happens. But there's a concept called adaptive leadership. that they have written about. There's the little reference at the bottom. You should be able to click on it. You can go right to it. It's a really excellent part of their site. But what we tend to talk about, so we come to meetings like this and we talk about technical leadership. It's important. It's sort of knowing what are the active ingredients and how to do them, and we talk a lot about the mechanics of that. What we don't talk about is adaptive leadership. And adaptive leadership is sort of that leadership magic that the quote that the National Implementation Research Network uses is it's changing the hearts and minds of people to get them to do the work. It's being able to do the work when you don't yet know the answer. So when you go in to implement, you know maybe what's worked in research, but you don't know if it's going to work in your context. You don't know how to solve the problems that are going to come up. That's adaptive leadership. That requires cultivating principals and superintendents and other decision makers that's like a pause point from Gawande's kind of conceptual framework, where those people are empowered to be able to be dynamic leaders who can adapt what they know, they can generalize, they can try things, they have a system for knowing what works, and they can make it work in their setting. So technical leaders are good managers. They're engaged. I mean, it's important. You have to be a good technical leader, too. They're quick to recognize and respond to issues that arise. That means they don't hide in their office. That's hard. Lots of principals want to hide in their office when things are not going well. It's always a brave and very important principal who will show up and run the car line because the car line was a disaster the day before, right? That's a good sign. Organize groups to solve problems and regularly produce desired results. But technical leadership works only when you're in the zone of less complexity and the answers are known. When you're in the zone of greater complexity and the answers are not known, which is often where we are operating, you have to have this magical ability, which we can operationalize, we can talk about. It's called adaptive leadership. I won't read that, but I think it's just a great quote. And the point of the quote is that, I'll let you read it as I tell you about it, but the point of the quote is that when you want people to make changes, which is what we are about, let's be more effective, it is inherently destabilizing. It is inherently uncomfortable for people. So you know going into it, you are creating discomfort. That requires a whole lot of people skill to be able to walk people through that and not lose them and have them be willing to walk through that discomfort with you. So activity 3, and I'm going to cut you off fast, but it's just to get you thinking, is to jot down a definition for yourself of what you think adaptive leadership looks like. Reflect on your own capacity for adaptive leadership. My guess is you probably are good adaptive leaders, and that's why you're in the position that you're in. And it might be interesting even to think about that yourself, and how can you operationalize some of what has worked for you to help your colleagues in your state, maybe who don't have those skills naturally. How can you cultivate that among your school leaders? I'm going to get in 3 minutes. Is that okay with people? Is that just as you're warmed up, I'll cut you off? Is that good? Okay.
The norm, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay, let's come back. I know you're just getting warmed up. Is that a helpful concept? Had you all heard of that before? Had anybody thought about adaptive leadership before? Yes. Okay, you're ahead of me. It's like a new concept to me, but I mean, I can tell you what happened with me in my early days of implementation. I used to work in Arizona, and we did a nice district-wide RTI implementation in a little district called Vail School District, who I still work with. I love them, in Arizona. And in my early days, I learned some powerful lessons about, just how to work with people, and I realized in hindsight that we were very effective there because they gave me grace. Truly, because my whole tactic was, we have the right answers, and so if a teacher was questioning something or a principal questioned something, I said, oh, well, let me just explain why you're wrong, right? And they tolerated me. It was so great, because I think sometimes what happens is what people are really saying is, I'm anxious, I'm afraid, right? And the way you know is you start to answer, let me tell you why it's going to work, and you shouldn't feel the way you feel, right? Psychology 101, that's like the first rule of what, and I did this. And so anyway, the way you know you're doing that is they just change the complaint, right? And then you just start to think they're difficult, and you want to avoid them. But adaptive leadership says, go find that, figure that out. They're probably saying, I'm anxious, I'm uncomfortable. So if you're a teller, like I was a teller, this is some great advice from a guy named Edgar Schein, which it's a fun, I actually listened to this book on audio. It's called Humble Inquiry, and it's a really good practical book. And you could read it, of course, but it's nice to listen to on audio. He actually reads it. And he talks about, these are some simple tactics you can deploy to be less of a teller and more of giving people that you're working with a sense that they really have been heard and understood. And I won't read all of those to you. I only want to point out one, which is the last one. Well, maybe two. One thing that we all do is we rush in to give answers because we are uncomfortable with letting people not have the answer right away. And it is a way more, just we see teachers do that too, but it's a much more powerful learning opportunity if you can provide the right environment for that discomfort to live for half a minute and let them arrive at the answer is better. And then the other one that I want to point out is confrontational questioning. At some point you may have to do it. You may have to do that. It's lovely when peers confront peers in a data team meeting and can do that in a way because you have the right trust and the right rapport. But you have to just recognize when you do it, you've just burnt a whole lot of trust and rapport that has to be reestablished and earned. So it's something to be, it's not that you should always avoid confrontational questions. We have to do that. We have to ask those questions. But you burn a lot of credit when you do that. So to build credibility, part of it is that a leader has to make him or herself vulnerable to ask for information. And the part that you owe your people is, I'm not going to use this to punish you. So I'm not going to ask you if you do something, and then when you admit to me that you do, I'm going to tell you how stupid you are, right? Why you shouldn't do it that way, right? So you make yourself vulnerable to learn information. You use that information to strengthen your procedures, your practices, your institutional practices to improve outcomes, but don't punish the teller, and you'll have an increased probability of getting important information in the future because you don't have access to everything. You don't have access to all those closed doors where teachers are working. And this is another one of my favorite quotes that John Hosp, I give him credit for this. I love John Hosp. You might know him. He wrote the ABCs of CBM, Michelle and John Hosp. He says, don't bring data to a faith fight. And that's what I did in my early days, right? So I don't believe in timed assessment. Well, let me tell you why you're totally wrong with data. And I'll even show you a picture. And I still do that, but at least now I soften it a little bit first and go, tell me more about that. Where's the kernel of truth? What are you worried about? You're worried about kids being anxious? Definitely don't want kids to be anxious. Let's talk about the pros and cons, right? It's a slightly different approach, but it's better than let me tell you why you're wrong. So don't bring data to a faith fight. It's all about trust, and so you have to systematically cultivate trust with people, which means they have to be understood before you can persuade them to do the things that you're trying to get them to do. I love this quote from Elmore: "For every increment of performance I demand from you, I have an equal responsibility to provide you with the capacity to meet that expectation." Teachers are under such enormous stress, and you know there was a big cheating scandal in Atlanta a couple of years ago, and I remember at the time I was talking with an independent school leader, and the independent school world measures nothing. Like, they create their own measures so they don't have to get compared to. It's just crazy to me, but and then they kick kids out who can't do it, and they go to and attrition is not an intervention. So I have a little trouble with that world. But this independent school leader said to me, "Cheating is inevitable when you have accountability." And I said, "That's crazy. That's crazy, because accountability is about figuring out where the soft spots are to gain improvements, not about hanging people." Well, that's if you embrace this approach. And clearly the leaders in the Atlanta schools at that time did not embrace that approach. By the way, I did see on Twitter, I get all my best news on Twitter, that those, their trials are they did their appeal and they failed. So they are in big trouble for that. So I love Edgar Schein's definition of trust. I'll offer it to you. I think it's a powerful one. It's nice to reflect as you read it if you think you are trustworthy as a leader in your context. What about your leaders? Think about principals and superintendents in your state, directors of curriculum and instruction and special education. So trust is believing that the other person will acknowledge me, not take advantage of me, not embarrass or humiliate me, tell me the truth, not cheat me, but rather work on my behalf and support the goals that we have agreed to. That's a pretty high standard. But if you don't meet that, you can't sustain system change in your setting. So here are some takeaway pearls. You have to cultivate an enabling context for the effort. That means you know you're going to create chaos and disruption. That's what change is all about. People are going to be uncomfortable. So you have to manage that actively. That's the adaptive leadership part. Work on trust and credibility, and while giving people the technical know-how to be able to get the good results so that they'll be reinforced to do more. It helps to identify an external facilitator. You know, you can't be an expert in your own backyard, so it really does help to have an outside person sometimes who can come in, who's more neutral and can help moderate that. You can take one slice of a system when you're ready to implement and implement fully throughout that slice. The National Implementation Research Network calls that the transformation zone. I have an example of that on a slide from some work that we're doing in Pennsylvania. But what's great about that, the point of that is it's a small scale that touches all the layers for which it has to be successful, so that when you run into barriers and problems, you can troubleshoot it with a small number of students rather than a full district or, God forbid, a full state of children. So leaders have to be available for rapid response to issues. Things can't wait. When things don't go as planned and people are mad and people are upset, that is not the time to say we'll talk about it at our regularly scheduled meeting in 2 weeks. Can't work. So if you're committed to actually make the effort, you have to be able to be rapidly available to debrief, to troubleshoot, and to move forward. And to say, it didn't go well, it's going to go better next time, this is what we learned, this is what we're going to do differently. You know, one of the cardinal mistakes that places make, anybody bought a car in the last couple of years? Were you asked to fill out a survey? Yeah, were you asked to lie? Right. It's so stupid, but you're asked to fill out a survey, and they basically say, I need you to give me all fives. If there's any reason you can't give me all fives, I want you to tell me right now, because I really need you to give me all fives. And I'm like, well, do you want me to be honest, or you want me to give you all fives? I want you to give me all fives. I mean, really, that's the answer. But you know, people who do survey work, who are leaders, understand you should never ask for feedback unless you intend to get honest feedback and do something about it. You will do more harm than good if you send out a survey over SurveyMonkey that says, what did you like about this process, what worked, what didn't work, and then you don't make a change in response to that information. You're better off not asking. Don't ask. So that's That's a Pearl. Outcomes-oriented frequent evaluation with a database to guide decisions and adjustments. So that's, again, that's back to that program evaluation, which that second question was in the poll. You have to have data on use, you have to have data on effects, and you have to be willing to respond to it. So the purpose of a pilot, that's a wonderful quote from the National Implementation Research Network. I love their work. And then that's the graphic I told you I would show you. This is showing a slice. Is Pennsylvania here by any chance? Yay, Pennsylvania! Oh, I'm totally going to say nice things. How could I say anything not nice about Patton? I love Patton. Okay, so this is an example because I'm involved in a project there. They're using my math software. So, so this is the way they have set this up, which I think is really, really thoughtful and is taking a slice across all layers. And so what they have is they have the State Department here, the state leaders, the external trainers. These folks are making resource allocation decisions and they're monitoring. And then they have what they, by the way, PATN stands for Pennsylvania Technical Training Assistance. Other way, Training and Technical Assistance Network. And I think of them as the RTI arm for Pennsylvania. I hope that's okay for me to say that, but that's how I think of them, among other things that they do, right? And that's how I know them, of course, is through that. And so then there are Patton coaches. They have, for the thing that we're doing, they have 5 regional coaches, and these folks have to have a different skill set. So you can articulate what's the skill set that matters for these folks. They have to be truly technical experts of whatever the process is that they're training. They have to have technical mastery of whatever the new model is. And then the way they're doing it is they have 15 schools that are spread across the regions, and so each school has a school team. And these folks are the ones who are actually going to engage in the effort. They're going to do math RTI for kids in K-8, for example. So these, what are the skills that matter here? They also have to demonstrate technical mastery of the new model. They're learning directly from these folks, okay? And then 1 grade per school is the way they're doing it, which is a genius way to do it, because when you run into barriers with RTI, it's generally at the school level. So it's easier to fix that with 1 grade before you spread to all the other grades. I mean, think about this in your own work. It makes a lot of sense, right? Once you've done it, you've gone all the way through one time, which can happen way faster than 1 year, you can spread to the other grades. That's just called smart scaling. But it is a smart way to scale up a new effort when you take a slice across all of the layers for which it matters. Okay, another quote. All right, so I don't want to downplay that you have to have technical mastery. You do have to know what the active ingredients are, the things that count, because you're going to be helping people do those things that are going to get the results that you want. You cannot ignore your slow adopters. I had a wonderful conversation over the phone with Dean Fixon in the last couple of months, and he said something that was so funny. He said, change by retirement. You can wait for people to retire. I thought that was great. There are always going to be slow adopters. You could call them resistors because often they are very resistant. They seem very resistant. This is a hike in Tucson, Arizona that I have done and not completed several times because of thunderstorms. But you're hiking on this hike. Anybody a hiker? Yes? And you can see this mountaintop and you go, there's no way that's where, it just seems so incredibly far away. And in fact, you find out later that yes, you are going to the top of that mountain if you can get there before the afternoon thunderstorms. But the problem is with slow adopters, you cannot show them the peak and say that's where we're going. This doesn't work, right? Your thoroughbreds, your high flyers, guess what? They're consultant proof, consultant indifferent, that's it. They're going to do it. No matter what. You show up, they say that sounds good, I'm going to do it, I'm going to adapt it to fit in my classroom, I'm going to make it happen. That is not a measure of the success of your training effort. The thoroughbreds were going to do it anyway. You had no effect. The slow adopters are usually, we don't get to them until year 2. And it's not fun. And I don't know a cheaper way to do it. I'm going to tell you the way I do it, and then you can tell me if you know a better way. And I'm serious about that because this is a struggle. It's not fun to bring these folks along. I find that what you have to do with slow adopters is just ask them for a little bit. Just a little bit, just a tiny piece. We're not even talking about going to this peak. We're just going to look at this tree or to see what that bird is over there. And, you know, I don't know where it's going to go from there. We'll see. You're not committed, it's okay, right? And you walk with them, you give them a little water, you give them a little snack. This is hiking with my daughter, by the way. She's a slow adopter. She's 10. But the point is, you cannot say to my 10-year-old, we're going to the top, let's go, stop whining, suck it up, I'm going to leave you in the dust. It doesn't work. So there's going to be protesting. There's going to be noise. You cannot tend to all of the noise. I always give the example, when my son was a little guy, he hated to take a shower. And you would say, it's time to take a shower, Ben, and he would just like lay down on the floor. Why do I have to take a shower? I took a shower yesterday, because you need to take a shower every day. And so what I learned to do with him was really like behavioral momentum and shaping, and I would say, all right, Ben, we're not talking about taking a shower. We are just walking to the other side of the house where your shower happens to be. Let's just go over there and see what. He would go along like protesting the whole time. And we would break it into little pieces like that. And lo and behold, that child would be getting out of the shower still complaining about why he had to take a shower. But he took a shower. And what you hope is that the pleasure of being clean, it didn't work for him, but the pleasure of being clean would then say, hey, this was pretty cool, I want to do more of that, it wasn't so bad. That happens with the slow adopters. It really does. If you can put the work in and you can get them there, but sometimes it takes a whole year, they're suddenly so successful. I've worked with teachers who literally didn't want to come to school and face their classroom because they were so unsuccessful with their students. And then at the end of the year, they had mastered running class-wide intervention, and suddenly disruptive behavior goes away, because when you're giving children work that they can do, and it's very structured, you don't even have to tend to disruptive behavior. It goes away like magic. It did in this case with this guy that I'm thinking of in California, and suddenly they like to do it and they want to do more of it. So you have to tend to your slow adopters. There's a guy named Aubrey Daniels. He's a behavior analyst, and he writes about traditional accountability, mostly in business. And he says this is the way management typically flows. It's very top-down. And so the executive really almost never talks to the frontline implementers. It flows this way, from executive to manager to supervisor to frontline. And Aubrey says that's all wrong. By the way, he's the guy who coined the term organizational behavior management. You ever heard that term? That's Aubrey Daniels. He's written lots of books. He has a company in Georgia, in Atlanta, Georgia, and he trained with B.F. Skinner. So he really is but he works outside of education, so you wouldn't necessarily know him. He wrote the best chapter, titled something like How I Would Run a School, if I could. And if you want it, I will send it to you. The Wing Institute published it. I scanned it, and so I have a scanned copy. So if you want a copy of it, email me. I will send it to you. It's a quick read. It's very, very well done. But he says the way it should work is called reverse behavioral engineering. And that is, everything should begin with the frontline definition. What is it that we want to see happening between the teacher and the child every single day? And by the way, that's where all the variance is. Like, I'm a researcher. We're always looking for what can we put into our models that will eat up some variance in student outcomes. Nothing competes with teacher quality, the quality of the teacher-student interaction. That's so important for teachers to hear. Free and reduced lunch doesn't compete once you control for quality. All kinds of things we worry about doesn't even compete once you control for the quality of the instructional interaction and you ensure it's a high quality. Nothing beats that. So if you start with that at your front line, then you can ask, what is it, everything else that occurs outside of the teacher-student interaction, that relationship, those instructional interactions that unfold every day, every single layer in the school should be designed to support what is happening on that front line. That's an interesting filter to apply, to think about the structures that you have in your system and to ask, are they really supporting the quality of the instructional interaction that's unfolding between the teacher and the student? That is a new way of thinking. It's a new way to think about it, because we've got all kinds of things and practices that we do by convention, that we do by habit, that do not meet that standard. And it's just an interesting way to rethink the extent to which you are supporting what's most important. So in education, we're also very guilty about, we have sort of our espoused values, but then these are not well aligned with our reward systems. And I'll give you a classic example is paying teachers based upon years of experience and degree, your highest degree earned. Those are variables that are not systematically related to higher quality teacher-student interaction and better student outcomes, and yet that's how we built our pay structure. It doesn't make any sense. Our reward system is out of sync with our espoused value, which is we want to support the highest quality instruction for every child, and every child should grow. So that's something we can look at. Okay, and that's a quote from Aubrey, which I will let you read at your leisure. So what happens is once you start to engage in building trust and demonstrating technical mastery, but thinking about adaptive leadership and credibility and managing the discomfort of a change process and tending to your slow adopters so they can be successful. Especially in the world of RTI, what happens is there's a culture shift. Once you have enough implementation, suddenly you see this shift where people are not fighting over limited, scarce resources, but instead are recognizing if I'm the 6th grade math teacher, I care about what's happening in 3rd grade math. I don't want 3rd grade math to be so crappy that I can continue to point to 3rd grade math and say, hey, I'm so great, look how great I am, because 3rd grade math is so crappy. Because what happens is if 3rd grade math is stronger, then I do a better job. I get better results because we're all responsible for all learners in the system. And you do absolutely have to manage your message. You ever worked in a toxic environment? You have any toxic environments in your state? They exist. I mean, it's real. The problem is if you don't address it head on, it can take on a life of its own. And you know, a lot of times leaders in education really weren't trained to be great leaders. We weren't. Often we were former teachers or some other professional working in the schools. Then we sort of apprenticed and became maybe a principal and climbed from there. We weren't really trained to be great leaders, and yet we talk about the most socially meaningful work on the planet, in my mind, is running educational systems. We should be functioning like the very best CEOs in terms of leadership, and we don't always have that opportunity. So this is something a lot of places do not do well. They don't know how to do it. So they sometimes they're just sort of scattershot. It's like sometimes I'll use my personal relationship with you to try to get you to be less toxic. Sometimes I'll avoid you because you make me crazy. You know, I think you have to take a very direct and intentional approach to managing the message. You know where your toxicity is if you're a leader, and you go directly to it, you seek it out, you say, here is your opportunity, this is the way you can give me this critical feedback that I know you want to share. I will receive it, I will hear it, this is the outlet for it, and it doesn't leave this room. It is not appropriate for this negative feedback or critical feedback to be discussed in front of parents in parent-teacher conferences. It's not appropriate to be discussed in large faculty meetings unless we have structured the time for it and invited it. I mean, I personally think you have to contain it that way, or it can really, truly take on a life of its own and ruin what is a really good effort. So Bushel and Bear say the first thing you have to do is find out where you are. That's easier than it has ever been with high-stakes testing that happens at the end of every year, as well as way too much universal screening. I mean, you definitely know where you are. If you don't know where you are lost. But the great news about that is everyone should grow. And Maynard Reynolds said that in 1975, that assessment today should be about making a difference in the lives of children rather than making a prediction about their lives. He said that in 1975. We can forecast so well, but what we really need to be about is violating that forecast. Okay, so you guys are doing great. We're in our last 15 minutes, and I think I'm going to finish all my slides, but I'm going to give you 3 minutes to think about, in your system, can you identify systems that don't talk to each other? Could be special ed, could be, not to pick on special ed, it just comes to my mind given what I do. Systems that don't talk to each other, and what ideas from innovative technologies that you can think of that might help that, okay? 3 minutes, and then this is your last activity. I think. There might be one more. Okay, I'm cutting you off. Just as you got warmed up, we are in the last home stretch. 10 more minutes. You guys are doing so great. I want to tell you some contemporary findings in implementation research. Some of my work, I'm biased, but I want to share with you some things you can take away and you can try in your own setting, and that's what we'll finish on. So I want you to think about this. The typical education approach is to say, okay, an innovation is not working. Something's not working. So what do? We add components to it, which does what? It increases the complexity required to correctly implement, which, by the way, is a big predictor that it won't be implemented well. This decreases the probability of correct use, and then the innovation is still not working. So we have this very negative, this is the way most systems do it, and it just doesn't work. It's foolhardy. There's a smarter way to support implementation. You can actually identify the function of what, in terms of like thinking about the organization, what's the cause? What is the cause of incorrect implementation, and then how can we address that? Identify the currencies that matter to people. Even like this is a slide that's focused on teachers. Some teachers are really rewarded by child learning gains, and that's enough. So if you can, then what you know is I need to show them the gains every time they use it correctly, so they'll be motivated to do more. Basic kind of behavior analysis, except with adults and with the system. So this is some work that we're doing. I mentioned I have some RTI software for math for K-8, and what we're doing, because we need people to interact with the software to do the work, we've created an implementation chain, a behavior chain, to support implementation. So we know, like, these are the basic steps that need to happen. The rosters need to get uploaded, then there's a screening, and then we have class-wide intervention where it's needed, and then we have individual intervention where it's needed, and interpreting data. Those are linear pieces that need to unfold in a certain way. So what we do is we send what we call implementation briefs, which are 4-pagers of how to get started for each of these steps. We have it on the web. You could go to the help portal and get it there, but we actually email it to the teacher. And so what happens is the rosters are entered, so now the teacher can log in and approve the roster. This is the teacher behavior that we want to occur. And so then we send the brief, how to get started, how to upload your rosters. That's our antecedent. This is the teacher behavior. The consequence is the antecedent for the next action. So now when this has happened, we send by email to the teacher how to do the screening, which is very simple. The computer provides everything you need, but it's really a prompt. It's an antecedent. It's a cue that is saying to the teacher, we want you to do the screening. So then this is the behavior that we're looking for from the teacher, and then the consequence for this behavior is also the antecedent for the next behavior. So that's a behavior chain. That's how it works. So when the teacher has completed the screening, which we know from our database, we can tell, then that triggers in our system an email that goes out to the teacher with the how-to brief for class-wide intervention. By the way, we have short videos for each of those too. And then that's a prompt, hopefully, for the teacher to get started with class-wide intervention. And that's the behavior we want from the teacher, the consequences. So you kind of see, you can follow it that way. And it's just a different way to think about supporting implementation, translating an old idea. Oh no, if I had known I animated all of those, I would have pressed those buttons sooner. Okay, what happens in most places is we only focus on antecedent supports for implementation. And this is probably true in your own setting. I've been showing these ideas for years, and I'll say to an audience, like, you know, what do you think the chances are of correct intervention use if you have been provided with all the materials to implement the intervention? You say, okay, I agree to, I find it acceptable, I'm not like philosophically opposed to the intervention. You give the teacher some training and you watch the teacher do it to a fluency criterion on 2 consecutive trials, so you know they can correctly perform the intervention. And then you go away and covertly monitor, what do you think the probability of correct intervention use is under those conditions? You say hi. Of course, I asked and then I called you out. I'm sorry. You would think it would be high. It's 12%. 12%. Those are from the best single subject studies that met those criteria. Okay, when I show that to teachers and I say that, then I usually say to teachers, that's also probably more support for intervention implementation than you've ever had. And they nod. They always nod. Okay, so my point to you is not to be discouraging, but to say if all of that's not enough, what is? And it's consequence supports. It's consequence supports. Antecedent supports are important, and they include things like this is about minimizing complexity. So the fewer steps in the intervention, the more likely it is to be correctly implemented. The fewer adults that are required for implementing the intervention, the more likely it is to be correctly implemented. Making the intervention as easy to use as possible. All materials are provided. The teacher has had some in-class coaching to do the intervention with somebody who has used that intervention before. The intervention is acceptable to the teacher. There are too many good interventions out there. If a teacher says, I'm just philosophically opposed to this and I don't like it, guess what? They're not going to do it. So pick another one. Pick another one that is acceptable. Okay, the behaviors that we're looking for are intervention use, the quality, the consistency, and the child response. The consequence piece we never tend to. This is what we don't do well. So if you do the antecedent pieces right, you get about 12% correct implementation. But if you use consequences, you can get it up to 100% pretty consistently. And so what are the consequences that work? Performance feedback. Performance feedback, that's the term in the literature if you wanted to look it up. And basically performance feedback means somebody's checking, somebody's showing up in a very friendly way saying, hey, gee, I noticed on Thursday the intervention didn't get done. How can I help you today? Do you need more materials? Did something go wrong? And the teacher will say, oh, well, we had an assembly, and that's why. Or the child was absent. You go, oh, okay. All right, well, I'll check back with you next week. When they know you're coming, they'll do it. That's all there is to it. It's very, very, very effective for the vast majority of teachers, but it's not easy to do. It takes some time, and it's something that we don't do well. So here are some pearls from the literature. If you're going to do performance feedback, it needs to be graphed. You cannot go thinner than weekly. Weekly works, daily works, but daily is very expensive. Weekly works and can produce adequate implementation. You go beyond weekly, it doesn't work anymore. So it's got to be weekly, and then you need to tie it to child performance gains so people can see the value of that. And this is really like the last thought that we're going to finish on, because I kind of wanted to give you a couple minutes for questions. Instead of doing the activity, these are my favorite apps. I use all kinds of apps to run my life, like most people do these days. You ever use the Waze app? It's like the greatest app on the planet, right? Well, I wanted to get you thinking about what is it about these things that have changed our lives? Like, we are willing to engage with these tools. Number one, they're useful to us, right? Number two, they're easy to use. They're intuitive. Number three, sometimes they prompt us when we don't come back, right? And that makes us re-engage. You can think about some of this in education. How can we profit from some of what works so well with these tools and embed some of that into what we are doing to support interventions in schools? I'm gonna flash to the I'll show you this is my coach and administrator dash that comes from my work. We are tracking some new metrics that I promised Jennifer I would tell you about. And I know you can't totally read them on the screen. This just actually comes from my demo account. But this is the coach and the administrator dashboard. So here, this bar, the principal or the coach could click and it would show where screening has been completed, where it has not. Down here you can't see it, but it's giving us a summary of the screening data. Most importantly, here it says you've got class-wide intervention going on in this class. If I click here, I can go directly to the teacher dashboard. And then the metrics that we're tracking that are new and are superior to direct observation have to do with trials to criterion. So think about its trials to criterion data. We're looking for rate of progress that students are making, and we are looking at score entry, consistency of score entry. And those two little metrics outperform direct observation if you want to know if interventions are occurring as planned. So you could take that away. You could embed that into whatever you are doing. I mean, that is not copyrighted. You can do that in your own setting. With any intervention you want to run, you can get more accurate estimates of how how well things are being used, if you try to track think about it like trials to criterion data. What is the rate of progress that is occurring as a result of the use of the innovation, and what is the actual use of the innovation that you can detect from permanent products? Like in our case, you can't do this if you don't actually enter the scores, because you can't get the intervention packets until you enter the score, because we use the score to give you the packet. So we can track that, and it tells us very sensitively whether intervention is occurring. There they are. Intervention progress, intervention consistency, average weeks per skill mastery, and we will prompt, like it says here, you need to go visit this class for the coach, and when the coach does that, the coach can reset the integrity metric to take them back to 100%, so they can escape. It's hard to climb away from a 0% integrity score. You'd be getting coach visits every week for 20 weeks. So once a coach has visited, we reset it to 100% and give you a chance to mess it up again before we come back. So I'm going to show you just the last slide, which has my contact info. And if you want to take questions, we're right at. But I'm happy to take questions. I would love to have a couple of questions if anybody has a question. Is that okay? Okay. Or if you're ready to go, I understand that too. You're probably flying home today, huh? Okay. Any questions, really? Like quick questions? No? Okay. What I will do is I'll stick around. If people do want to have any questions come up, I'd be glad to answer questions. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Amanda. I appreciate that. It's a lot to digest for sure. So I'm going to go ahead and step out of protocol for a minute. I said we'd go over the agenda this morning. It's good we didn't go over it because I'm going to change it slightly now. So on the agenda it says a 20-minute break or a 15-minute break, and then we come back and we'll do closing thoughts. One of the things that we get in our post-event poll every year is feedback that, hey, we want some more time. We're packing a lot into this day and a half. It's go, 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 move, move, move. But we need more state time also, right? So what I'm going to do is quick closing thoughts, and then I'll let you all go. One thing to keep in mind is we do have this facility until 1 o'clock today, so if states aren't getting on planes and going right away, you're welcome to stay here and work and carve out space and time to do that as well. Final thoughts are a little bit about communication and marketing, the SPDG event or SPDG communities, and then the post-event poll I'll talk about. So first off, communication marketing. It resonated with me when Amanda said manage your message, right? Got to manage your message. And so kind of a focus of this meeting was thinking about how do we put together infographics? How do we get information about the work that you're doing out to other projects that may be able to align efforts so we're not duplicating effort as much also. As well as how do you then contact other states? How do we market what we're doing so other states know what we're doing and we can align our efforts maybe with some of theirs so we're not duplicating effort there also. So please think about what are the related areas that the SIG network can support you in this, and do not hesitate to reach out to myself, and even though Jennifer's Coffee's not here, I'll say reach out to her also, and let us know your thoughts about that. The SPDG communities, of course, are going to continue going on. We've got a new one starting. It's the Inclusive Practices community, so we'll get that off and running. If you want to be part of that, we'll be sending out an email.